full realization of what black holes were, but that's what these lectures are about. And of course, with the first detection of gravitational waves, it came from the merger of binary black hole systems. So gravitational waves and black holes have been going hand in hand for over 100 years now. We're going to have 3 lectures from Eric, but also we have a public lecture. I forget the date.
Next Monday.
Next Monday. There'll be a public lecture in town as well. That'll be in French, though.
Yes, I guess, because it's public.
But anyway, we'll have lots to hear
If
about.
you want to practice your French. Yes, a good chance.
Anyway.
Trou noir, yes.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So I've prepared a web page to put material relative to the lecture. On this web page, you will find, if you go on it, you will find some the slides that I'm showing today, some lecture notes which are in the draft stage at the moment, and some worksheet also to do some computation, some SageMath worksheet basically. So this is what you have on this web page. Okay, so let's start with the lecture. So this is a lecture on introduction to black holes in general relativity. First, I will set up a framework, which is relativistic spacetime, and we had just before a lecture about general relativity. Then we will try to define, in this context of spacetime of general relativity, what is a black hole. We try to define it, giving first a naive definition. And then we will see that this definition will drive us towards understanding what is a null hypersurface in general relativity. I'm going to define all these terms, of course. And then we will focus on something which, in some sense, model black hole in equilibrium, namely non-expanding horizons and killing horizons. And finally, at the end, we will give a proper general, very general definition of a black hole in general relativity. So this is the lecture for today. Okay, so let's start with the framework first. So, of course, I will drive you to the lecture by Thomas about the GR background. But here I'm just setting the basic objects that we're dealing with, just maybe to give you the notations that I'm using. So, of course, we are doing general relativity. We could have spoken about black holes in terms of Newtonian mechanics. Maybe you know there is something with people in the end of 19th century who were considering objects, the gravitational field of which is so strong so that light cannot escape. So there was Laplace and Mitchell, but I'm not going to speak about this historical aspect. From the very beginning, I'm going to put myself in the framework of general relativity. Okay? So as you know, general relativity describes spacetime by a manifold and a metric on this manifold. So let me recall you what a manifold is. It's a topological space which locally resembles R4 because we are in 4 dimensions here. It means locally you can set a chart, so coordinate system, so that it looks like a piece of R4. It's R2 here actually for the picture. And this identification becomes genuine if you introduce the tangent spaces. You can introduce on a differentiable manifold the tangent spaces, and you can speak about vectors. The very first definition of vectors, you can see them as elementary vectors which connects 2 points on the manifold. But as soon as these 2 points are not infinitely close, you cannot speak about a vector connecting them, contrary to the Euclidean space. In Euclidean space, vector can be far away and you can connect them. On the manifold, you can do this only for infinitely close vectors, and you introduce this small displacement dx here. And all these vectors, they live in a plane, and you have many tangent planes at any point on the manifold. So this is the basic concept of differential geometry, this 4-dimensional space-time. Okay, so this is what I just said. So the second object, so in this framework, I need a manifold and I need a metric on the manifold, more precisely a Lorentzian metric. What does this mean? Thomas just before started to speak about tensors. I guess he will develop more in the next lecture, but let me tell you what I need here. I need to introduce this concept of a metric. So metric, technically, this is a field of non-degenerate symmetric bilinear forms on the manifold. What does this mean? First, it's a bilinear form. It means that it takes a pair of vectors. So in a given tangent space, you have two vectors, u and v. And to this pair, we associate a real number. Okay? So this is the concept of form. Bilinear means it is linear with respect of each of its argument here. And this number, usually, we express it in terms of a component of the vectors in a given coordinate basis, for instance, or more generally in a given vector frame. And then, for this, since it's a bilinear object, then it is entirely represented by a matrix. Okay, you know, bilinear form. You need a matrix to represent it, and then you plug here the components of your vectors, and you get a number. So it is this object. And in the previous lecture, Thomas dealt with only the Minkowski metric, so it was eta here, eta mu nu, but it's the same thing. It's simply G mu nu. It's a more general metric because we are in general relativity. And this metric, we take it to be of signature minus plus plus plus. What does this mean? This means that there exists some basis so that you can diagonalize the matrix and you can write it like this. So on the diagonal you have only 1 minus and 3 plus signs. So this is the so-called Lorentzian signature. Of course, if it was only plus signs, it would have been the Riemann signature, which is the signature of standard scalar product in Euclidean space. But here we are not in Euclidean space. Of course, we are in a Lorentzian space. This is what this word Lorentzian means here. Okay, so this is the basic object which gives the scalar product. And of course, as you know, this object, we are using it to measure the space-time interval that Thomas was referring to. And this space-time interval is given as simply as the scalar product along a curve of the elementary displacement, this vector dx here. So if I take dx square, the square is taken with the metric tensor, okay? So you can write it like this, and this gives a kind of length. It can be either positive, negative, or 0, because of this minus sign here. If it was only the Euclidean space scalar product, it's like this. It's always positive, because you will have square here. You will have dx square plus dy square plus dz square. It's always positive. But here, because of this minus signs, it can take any sign. And this leads us to a classification of vector field in three categories, depending on this sign. So when the scalar square with respect to the metric tensor G is strictly positive, we say that the vector is space-like. When it is 0, we say that the vector is null, or isotrope in sometimes. And when it is negative, we say that the vector is time-like. And we can have a graphic representation of this. All the null vectors, it's easy to see that they live on a so-called cone. It's a mathematical cone. It means if you multiply this object by a scalar, it remains on the cone. This is the so-called null cone. And this null cone has two sheets. The future null cone, we assume in all this lecture that the space-time is time-orientable. I don't want to enter too much into technicalities. So it means we have a concept of future direction and past direction on all the manifold. So the future null cone here and the past null cone here. So here, for instance, we have a past-directed time-like vector. All the time-like vector, they live inside the cone. And outside the cone, you have a space-like vectors. This is exactly the same thing as in special relativity, of course, because these things are local, point to point. Okay. So we may have a kind of picture of a whole space-time with a Lorentzian metric. So it's again, it's a 4-dimensional manifold. Here, I suppose 2 dimensions, it looks like a surface, but you have to imagine it's a 4-dimensional space. And at each point, we have a null cone. So here, since we are suppressing dimensions, this null cone reduces to 2 straight lines. But you have to imagine it's a 3-dimensional null cone, actually. Okay, so we have, so this is a kind of picture representation of a metric. Because these null directions, they are the fundamental directions, because they will be the direction of the null geodesics and the trajectories of the photons. And they set up, actually, the causal structure of a manifold. Okay. Something that I want to maybe to, so this is a technicality that I will use, so I want to insist on it. Probably you know this already if you are a little bit familiar with relativity. It's raising and lowering, sorry, raising and lowering the indices. This is a kind of usual gymnastic that you are using in relativity. Here we present it like this. Given a vector, if I have a vector, u, can be a displacement vector or whatever, then there exists a unique linear form that I did not have the same letter, but I put this line under it, such that taking the scalar product of another vector v with u is the same thing as taking this linear form acting on a vector. You know that a linear form, by definition, it takes a vector and it gives a real number. This is the very definition, and in a linear way. So here we may use this quantum mechanics notation, for instance, this bracket notation to denote the action of a linear form on a vector. It's a number, and this number is expressible in terms of a component of a linear form. Because it is linear, it is simply a sum like this, and you see clearly that it's linear in V. And of course, we see that these components actually, because if we restore here the matrix of G, they are given simply by lowering the indices of U with a metric. This is this operation here. And usually we denote them without this underbar in it. Because when we have the index, we can distinguish between the component of a vector, they have the upper index, and the component of a linear form, they have the lower index. Okay, so this scalar product of two vectors, you can write it either with a metric tensor or with the dual linear form to the first vector or to the second one, as you wish, because this is symmetric. So everything is, you can commute the role played by V and U in this formula. So this is the standard formula for expressing the scalar product. If something is not clear at some point, please interrupt me. This is a lecture. This is not okay. You have to understand things. Okay. So now this was a kind of mathematical introduction in some sense. Now let's move to physics a little bit. So physics enters by the concept of world lines by considering first a particle in space-time. And you know, since we are dealing with space-time, a single particle, which is something that you may think of being point-like, it means you can neglect its extension with respect to other phenomena. Then in space-time terms, it's described by not a point, but by a line, because it evolves in time. Okay, so this line is called a world line. And the postulate here is that every massive particle is described by a time-like world lines. It means a world line, the tangent vector of which is always time-like. Okay, so this is the time-like world line. So it means this time-like world line, there is one in red here, because it is time-like, it is always inside the null cone. It cannot move outside the null cone at any point in space-time. And the massless particles, we postulate that they move on the null world lines. So it means that they all the time tangent to the null cone, because you see this is a green one. It is always tangent to the null cone here. And we may even imagine, because we have these three kinds of vectors, time-like, null, and space-like, that what about the world lines whose tangent vector is space-like? This will give a kind of strange particle, which they have a name. One calls them tachyon, because actually this is superluminal particle, because this constraint of being obliged for a massive particle to move inside the light cone is the geometrical translation of the impossibility to move at a speed greater than speed of light with respect to some inertial observer. So this basic postulate of general relativity, actually here it appears by this geometrical demand that we are dealing with time-like world line. And so if you move on a space-like world line, then this would be a kind of superluminal particle, which is by itself not completely excluded by relativity, provided it obeys, it remains always on space-like world line. But I don't want to deal with this today. We have no experimental proof whatsoever of the existence of any tachyon, so let's forget about the tachyon. Let's consider ordinary particles. So of course the prototype of massless particle is the photon. Okay. So for very simple particle, all the dynamics is in 4 vector, which is tangent to the world line, and this 4 vector is called the 4 momentum. And for instance, if you want to get the mass of a particle, you take the scalar square of the 4 momentum by the metric g, and because you are in a time-like world line, this is a negative number, so you put a minus sign here and you take the square root, so you get a well-defined real number, a positive number, and this is the so-called mass of a particle. If you do this with a photon, so if you put the p prime here, because it is a null vector, you will get 0 here, and you will recover that a photon is a massless particle. Okay. Another concept that is very physical is that of time, of course, and it's the basic, actually, physical concept in relativity, either special relativity or general relativity. As Thomas has insisted on the measure of times and with the clock, something like this, so the proper time. And in geometrical terms, the proper time is nothing but the length along a world line, even if the world line is not straight, like the trajectory of Alice, which was on the circle. So by the way, in space-time, the circle is not a circle, it is an helix, okay? If you move in space, if you have a space-time point of view of it. So Alice was moving on an helix, and you can take the tangent to this helix, and if you look at, you have an infinite displacement vector, what I call dx, the small displacement vector, which is tangent to the world line. It is inside the light cone, and you can define its scalar square, take its scalar square, sorry, I should have put a minus sign and a square root here. This is missing, I should correct this, of course, because this is a negative number, because we are time-like, so I should take minus square root, and this gives me a number, and this number, I can interpret it physically as being nothing but the proper time measured by Alice clock on this world line, okay? So this is, in some sense, the physical interpretation of a metric tensor. I have defined first the metric tensor as a geometric object, like this bilinear form, okay, on the manifold. This non-generate symmetric bilinear form of C nature minus plus plus plus. But you can view it physically as the object which gives you the proper time, which gives you the time that you measure along a line. This is the interpretation. Okay, and so once we have this proper time, we can divide, if you want, this vector dx by the length d tau. By definition, we will get a unit vector because we divide by its length, except that the unity is -1 because we are dealing with time-like vector, but okay. And this vector, it has to be collinear to the 4 momentum because we have seen before that the 4 momentum is always tangent to the world line. And actually, it's very easy to convince yourself that by the very definition of a mass, the factor of proportionality between P and U is nothing but the mass of a particle. Okay. And finally, regarding the framework of the lecture, the only thing that I need is, of course, the Einstein equation. This is the thing which says that we are dealing with general relativity, because that we have a manifold with a metric and proper time. It could be any relativistic theory of gravitation or what you want. Or, here, the fact that the metric tensor has to obey to this equation, and I guess Thomas will give many details about this equation in future lectures, so I will not enter into too much details here. Simply recalling that it later appears the Riemann curvature tensor of a metric, actually some trace of it. You have a trace here on this repeated index mu. So it's second order derivative of a metric, and you have another trace here, which is the Ricci scalar, okay? And possibly you have a cosmological constant, and as Thomas says, matters tells space-time how to curve. So this is why we have the energy momentum tensor on the right-hand side here. And in this lecture, I will take, because we are looking at not on cosmological scales, but on local scales, where I want to deal with black hole, I will take lambda equal to 0. And most of the time, I will take t also to be 0. I will consider vacuum things. And the thing that I want to stress is that the definition of black hole that we are going to provide is independent of the Einstein equation. But, so you can have a concept of black hole in other theories than general relativity, but some properties of a black hole that we are going to establish do depend on this equation. Some of us not. So I will make it clear when I'm using the Einstein equation and when I'm not using it, okay? For the rest of the lecture today, I can tell you right now, we are not going to use it at all. We will use it in other lectures. Okay, so this was the framework. So let's start now with the black hole thing and start to define a black hole first. So the question is, what is a black hole? And how would you answer with words to such a question? Because I guess everybody in the room has already heard about black holes, or even is interested by black hole, or possibly is even working, is doing his PhD in black holes and things like this. So what is for you the definition of a black hole? Somebody wants to answer? Yes? Yeah, yes. Yes. But then, how would you define an event horizon? Yeah, it's the next step. Yeah, yes, of course. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it's a pretty good definition of a black hole. It's more or less the one that we're going to adopt for today, except that we will take a space-time point of view. It means instead of speaking about a two-dimensional surface, we will speak about a three-dimensional surface, because we are at the time dimension, of course, when the space-time. Does somebody else want to add another definition or slightly modified definition? Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, yes, this could be, yes, this leads us, yes? Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah, it's also, yes, I think it's simplest definition. Yes? A collapsed star, yes, this is maybe how you produce a black hole. This is maybe not the very definition of a black hole. And maybe, some of black holes in the universe are not produced by collapse of stars. Maybe in the early universe we had formation of massive black holes from collapse of dust, of clouds. But it's, yes. Okay, so I think, yes, I'm up here to not to have heard one of the definition that sometimes people give is that it's a singularity in space-time, which maybe is a consequence of a definition, but it's not the very definition. It's not a singularity. It's not an infinite dense object. For instance, sometimes people answer this as for this. So I'm happy to hear that you already have a very clear notion of what a black hole is. Okay, so let me put some words in it. So it is basically a kind of summary of what you said here. I call this a lay person definition. A black hole is a localized region of space-time from which nothing can escape. By nothing, I mean no ordinary particle. Again, I'm not speaking about these tachyons thing or things like this. I'm speaking about massive particle or massless particles, so the so-called photons, can escape. And okay, this is definition with words. And what I want to stress in this definition, actually, we have two facets, two features. First one is that it has to be a localized region of space, not of space-time, maybe because it can be infinite in time, but at least in space, in some quite vague sense, but in space it has to be localized. And the second space, of course, it's the very essence of a black hole, is that you cannot escape from it, okay? This is the two basic things. So now this was a definition, quite vague definition with words. Let's try to formalize this to put this in the context of this relativistic spacetime, which is described by a Lorentzian manifold. So to do this, we will first focus on the second aspect. I mean, this thing that there is no escape from a black hole. We will come back, of course, to the first aspect later. Let's focus on this first aspect. So this first aspect says that you have a boundary to this object, and this boundary is impassable. I mean, you cannot go through the boundary. You can go maybe through in one direction, in one way, but not in the other way. Actually, this is what we call in GR, but in other field, a one-way membrane. Okay, you can cross it in one direction, but not in the reverse direction. And this boundary, it bears the names, as you said. It's the event horizon of a black hole. So we have to focus, how do we describe this in space-time language? What do you mean? What is a boundary? So because space-time is four-dimensional, if you want to have a boundary to something, I think it's pretty easy to convince yourself that this boundary has to be three-dimensional. Like in a three-dimensional space, if I want to enclose something into a boundary, this boundary has to be a surface, two-dimensional things. On the plane, the boundary has to be a line, like a circle. Okay, you are either inside the circle or outside the circle. Of course, in four-dimensional space, the boundary has to be three-dimensional. Okay, so, and three-dimensional, yes.
Are we talking specifically Schwarzschild?
No. For today, I will even not pronounce the word Schwarzschild, except right now, I guess, because we are going to be very generic. We want to define a black hole in all generality. And you know, Schwarzschild is very specific. It is static, non-rotating, and we have also the Kerr black hole. We have dynamical black hole. Yes. We will see. Actually, for black hole, it has to be really strict. I mean, you really cannot escape from it. This is the very definition of a black hole. It's not. Oh, you mean because you can go to another universe and this type? Okay, we will speak about this. But we will make this precise even today. So today the definition that I'm going to give does apply to the Kerr black hole. Even through the Kerr you can go to another place, but you will go to another space, but you can never come back to the place where you started from. So this is
Is it obvious that in our funny four-dimensional space-time that all three-dimensional surfaces have an inner and an outer?
no, it's not obvious. Yeah, I will, of course, move toward this. But first I want to convince you about the dimensionality. It has to be three-dimensional. And three-dimensional, this is what we call generically hypersurface, because let me remind you that the word hyper means y-dimensionless than the ambient space. So we could have said free surface, but hypersurface is more general, because if I live in a space-time with 5 dimensions, say, then hypersurface will mean 4 dimensions, 5 minus 1. So it's always minus 1. I could say that a line, for instance, in a plane is a hypersurface in that sense, because it's dimension 1 in an ambient space of dimension 2. So hyper means simply 1 dimension less than the ambient space. Okay, so it's not a complicated thing. You have to imagine it's a surface, except that it is 3-dimensional. It's a free surface. Okay, and since space-time is described by a Lorentzian manifold, actually we have 3 kinds of hypersurface in space-time. And we can characterize them by the normal, for instance, or by the induced metric. So a first kind is the so-called time-like hypersurface. What does this mean? This means that the normal, because it's a hypersurface and we are in dimension, it's a free surface, we are in dimension 4, so we have only one orthogonal direction to the object. Like, for instance, if you take a 2-dimensional surface in Euclidean space, you have only one normal at each point. Okay? So you have one normal, and for a time-like surface, the normal has to be space-like. Look at this figure. It is outside the light cone, so it's clearly space-like. And actually, the time-like surface cuts the null cone into 2 directions. So this hypersurface is a 3-dimensional space, which itself is a Lorentzian manifold. The metric induced by the space-time metric on this surface, because it has a light cone, it is the trace of this light cone here, it has its own light cone, it's a Lorentzian. The signature of induced metric here is minus plus plus, okay? So you can define time-like hypersurface either by demanding that the normal is space-like, or equivalently that the induced metric, it means the metric when you apply it only to vector tangent to the surface, is in nature minus plus plus. It's a Lorentz metric. So this is the time-like surface. Another natural kind of surface is, of course, space-like surface. It's exactly the opposite. The normal is time-like. It's inside the icon, as you can see. Here, you never cross the icon except at this point, so you don't have a trace. You don't have a trace of a icon on your surface. It means all the vector tangent here are space-like. In other words, the metric, the induced metric, has signature plus, 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 3 pluses. It's a positive definite metric. It's exactly like the metric of the ordinary Euclidean space. So here the scalar product is like the ordinary scalar product. For instance, the scalar square of a vector is always positive. It can never be negative. So it's a space-like hypersurface. And finally, you have a third kind of hypersurface is when it is tangent to the null cone. Here it was never tangent to the null cone. Here, I don't know if it is clear on this drawing, but it's tangent to the null cone, so that the past sheet is before us and the future sheet is below with respect to us to the null sheet. So in particular, this is the line of tangency here of the null cone. And it happens that the normal to it is also tangent to the hypersurface. This maybe is surprising to you that a normal can be tangent and not transverse. But because what is the definition of a normal? By definition, a normal is such that, so the normal n is such that for any vector v, saying that this vector is tangent to the hypersurface is equivalent to demanding that the scalar product with the normal is 0. You can see this as the definition of a normal. I have a vector, and this vector tells me that if a vector is tangent to my surface, so I have my surface, I have a normal here, and I consider another vector, and to know if this vector v is tangent to my hypersurface sigma, I take the scalar product. This is exactly the same thing that I have in Euclidean space. I have a normal to a sphere, n, and to know if a vector is tangent to the sphere, of course, I have to take the scalar product, and it is only for orthogonal vectors, of course, that they are tangent to the sphere. So it's the very definition of a normal. And on a null hypersurface, this means that the normal is null itself. And being null, by definition, it means that it's the scalar product of itself is 0. This is the definition of a null vector. And because of this definition of a normal vector, n is orthogonal to n, in some sense. So by definition of a normal, this means that n is tangent, to given point, to my hypersurface. So null hypersurfaces, there's this distinctive feature that the normal is tangent to them. This is, of course, not the case of a time-like surface. The normal is not tangent, and the space-like also, the normal is not tangent, is transverse. But for the null hypersurfaces, I insist, this is a very important property, the normal is tangent to them. Yes? Yeah. It's equivalent, yes. It's equivalent to say that the normal is null. And the normal is defined for any kind of surface by this equation. This is definition of a normal. Okay, for any hypersurface. The normal is such that it characterizes whether a tangent vector is tangent to the hypersurface. Yeah. Ouais. Yes, yes, yes. Any vector will obey this. And no. I'm choosing first. I'm defining an hypersurface as demanding that the normal is null. I don't know that it is tangent to the hypersurface yet. I'm demanding simply that its normal is null, because for time-like it's not the case. The normal is space-like, and for space-like the normal is time-like. Now I'm considering the third case when the normal is null. I have these three cases, three possibilities for the normal. I have a time-like, space-like, or null. Yeah. Exactly. exactly. You can see reasoning all the time with a normal. Say I have three kinds of normal: space-like, time-like, and null. When the normal is space-like, I say my surface is time-like. When the normal is time-like, I say the surface is space-like. And when the normal is null, I say that the hypersurface is null. And then I notice when in that third case, then the normal is itself tangent to the hypersurface. Okay? Yes. Yeah. But it will be not normal. You can choose two hypersurfaces. For instance, in Minkowski space in 2 dimensions, I have this one. So I can have L and K. They are both null vectors, okay? But they are not orthogonal. For instance, if you take KL, it will be a negative number, actually, like this strictly negative number. And so it means that K does not belong to I have H1 here and H2 here. With two, so this means that it's different from 0, that K does not belong to H, is not tangent, if you want, to H1. It's only tangent to H2. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So maybe take a time to think about this. This is important. This is important, actually, because when we are speaking about black hole, you will see we are speaking all the time about the event, the null hypersurface, because it turns out that the event horizon is a null hypersurface. So sometimes people are saying mistakes about event horizon because they don't have a clear view of simply what a null hypersurface is. And these things exist in Minkowski, so you don't have to go to complicated things like Schwarzschild or Kerr or things like this. You can think about it in terms of null hypersurface, and already you have this concept in Minkowski space. So please take a time to think about it. Yeah. Yes, isotropic or null. This is synonymous. You can say isotropic or null. Or light-like also. This is another synonymous. Light-like, null, isotropic, all these terms are exactly synonymous. In more mathematically oriented literature, it's most of the case they are calling this isotropic, yes. Actually, yeah.
Sorry, so you did that sort of classification of hypersurface.
Yes. Yes, you are perfectly right. Here, this is point-like definition, of course, because it could bend and becomes... Okay, in the rest of the lecture, I will focus about hypersurfaces. We have all the time the same gender. I mean, they don't change. Of course, in generic case, it could change, okay? And now that I know that I have at least at a given point these three types of hypersurface, I will go back to the definition of a black hole and try to think in terms of boundary. If I want to take this hypersurface to make a boundary of some region, what happens? So let's start with the first case, the time-like hypersurface. It's pretty easy to convince yourself, simply by making a drawing, no big computation, that it is a two-way membrane, because if I am a massive particle, ordinary physical object, I can go through, for instance, because if I am a massive particle, the only thing that I have to do is to move inside the light cone. This is the only constraint, okay? So it's pretty easy to convince yourself that by moving inside the light cone, I can go either from region 2 to region 1. So this 1 and this 2, this is the two regions that are delimited by the hypersurface, okay? The hypersurface is a boundary between 1 and 2. And the question is that crossable boundary in both ways? So I can go here by remaining inside the light cone from 2 to 1, or on the contrary, I can go from 1 to 2, okay? So we will say that a time-like hypersurface is a two-way membrane, so it is not eligible for black hole boundary. But we don't want a two-way membrane by the very definition of a black hole. Okay, so let's forget about time-like hypersurface as far as the event horizon is concerned. Then the next thing is the space-like hypersurface, and now it's a one-way membrane, clearly, because if I move to the future, of course, if you authorize yourself to move to the past, you can go downstairs. In all these space-time diagram here, the past will be always down and the future up, okay? And so if you, so I'm speaking about ordinary particles, so you move from the past to the future, so you have to move from region 2 to region 1, because your constraint is to move inside the light cone, you have no choice. It has to be like this. You can think about it a little bit, but you cannot never cross from 1 to 2. So a space-like hypersurface is clearly a one-way membrane. So in that sense, it is eligible to be a black hole boundary. And maybe we will see in the last lecture that in some description of dynamical black holes, we deal with space-like hypersurfaces. They are the so-called dynamical horizon. But let us focus on the last cases first, the null hypersurface case. So again, it's a hypersurface, so it separates space-time, at least locally, in two regions, 1 and 2. And then, since again my constraint is to move either inside the light cone or the limit to be tangent to the light cone, that you can see I have no choice, that I can go only from region 2 to region 1 on this case here. So again, a null hypersurface is a one-way membrane. You have a kind of limiting case here of this black trajectory, the tangent one to the hypersurface. It tries to go from 1 to 2, but it stays on the hypersurface. It's the kind of limiting case. To really go from 1 to 2, you will have to quit the light cone, and then you will become space-like, and it's not authorized for a particle. Yes? Yeah. Yes, yes, this is very important. Yeah. Yes. Yes, from all the background, I am assuming globally time-oriented manifold because yes, this is basic assumption. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, you are, because here we are reasoning pointwise. I'm demanding, so pointwise you can always orient things. You can decide that this is future, this is past. Okay, this is kind of convention when you are in a small region. And I'm demanding, of course, that all these particles are going pointwise from the past to. But as you say, by speaking about one way, two ways, of course, we are assuming this time irreversibility. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, there is an arrow. Yes, yes, yeah. Mm. Yeah, so the normal I could take minus n is a valid normal, okay, minus n. It's path pointing. Okay. So we have two surfaces which are eligible for black hole boundary, and of course, we are going to elect this one because it's a kind of marginal case, if you want, and it's a very specific one, and it's related to the null cones, which are the previous structure of space-time. So we are going to choose this one. Actually, at the end, we will prove, actually I will not give the detail of the demonstration, but we will prove that it has to be so. It has to be a null hypersurface, the way we define black hole. So we will. So you have to keep this in mind. The event horizon of a black hole is a null hypersurface in space-time. Okay. So this is a big motivation for studying the geometry of this object, to go slightly more into details about the property of null hypersurfaces. Again, I'm insisting on this. Usually, when we have an introductory course on black holes, we start straight with a Schwarzschild solution, and then we try to understand its property. I think it's better first to really have a good understanding of null hypersurfaces, because they have a key feature of black holes. I mean, the event horizon is a null hypersurface. So we have really to understand them if you want to say not silly things about black holes. Okay. So first, so we will describe now maybe slightly more mathematically what is a hypersurface. So a hypersurface is like a surface in three-dimensional space. To define it, you need simply one function to be the zero of some scalar function, some scalar field on your space. So if I have a function u, it goes from my manifold, takes a point in my manifold, and to that point it associates a real number. Okay, it's simply what we may call in physics a scalar field on the manifold. And so the hypersurface can be defined as the isosurface of that scalar field. It means it's the locus of points where the scalar field is 0, for instance. Okay, like you may say that in Euclidean space, a sphere is the locus of point where the scalar field is 0. So I take this to be u of x, y, and z. This would be my scalar field. And I can define any surface, actually, by such an equation, at least locally. And for a sphere, it will be this, simply, okay? And I need only one scalar field because I have a hypersurface. It's code dimension 1. It means it's -1 the dimension of the ambient space. So I need one scalar field. If it was a line in three-dimensional space, a circle, then for a circle, you would need another equation. For a circle, you would need the equation, for instance, z equals 0. This would define the equator, for instance, of a sphere, okay? So you will need two scalar fields. So I could this v, a function v of x, y, z is simply z, okay? So for code dimension 2, I would need two functions, but here I'm code dimension 1 because I have hypersurface. So I'm dimension 3, so I need simply one function. Simply here, this u is, if you want, a function of t, x, y, and z. And I'm asking, so I will describe, okay? Is it clear for everybody? Okay, so I have a scalar field. And then, something also that you know from the Euclidean space, the normal, n, the normal n, you can take it to be the gradient of a scalar field. Okay, the gradient, you can interpret it to the normal to the isosurface. This is pretty elementary thing. So I will do exactly the same thing in space-time here. I have my scalar field, I take the gradient. Of course, the gradient is a vector. Its component, okay, I take the covariant derivative to take the gradient. So its component, gradient of u, it's simply this component here. I have a partial derivative of u with respect to the various coordinates that I'm using on my manifold, and I raise the index because this is a one form. If you want, when you take this object, it's called a one form. It's at each point it's a linear form, and then I can raise the index with a metric. So this is again this metric duality. I get a vector, and this vector by definition is a gradient. This is what I did not by this nabla with an arrow on top of it. And to get a normal, actually, I can, so this by construction will be normal to the hypersurface. And then I may consider more general normals. I may allow for multiplication by a scalar field here, a scalar. And the scalar, I choose it to be negative. We'll see. This is a convention if you want. And in the form of an exponential of some scalar field rho. So I introduce a kind of degree of freedom here to be quite generic about the normal. So I've get this normal L, and this formula, again, if I translate it in terms of component, this is a 4-vector L alpha, so it is this, this guy, and as I said, this is raising the index of this object, and this object is nothing but the partial derivative of u, this is a one form. And saying that this is valid for any kind of hypersurface to be defined by a scalar field u, like the sphere in Euclidean space. But now, if I demand that H is a null hypersurface, remember by the very definition, it is saying that any normal is null, and in particular, L has to be null. And when I plug for L, when I replace L by its component here, I get this equation here in terms of u. So this is a characterization. If I want my scalar field u to be defined by this isosurface thing, null hypersurface, it has to obey this condition in terms of a metric tensor. This is the inverse metric here, and you have this contraction. Okay, this is a kind of equation. Okay, we have this now, and
Before you move on, so your E rows were just a set of scale factors?
yes, it's a scale factor to have more freedom, because you will see in the examples, I could choose u to be a simple function, and for some reason, except in particular in general relativity, it will be the normalization at the normal at infinity, for instance. I can put a scalar in front of it. This does not change the normal character, of course. I am free to do this. I'm doing this. Okay. So let's take example. I'm going to illustrate this with example. The simplest example of a null hypersurface you may think of is simply a plane in Minkowski space, because a plane is the simplest surface. When I say a plane, of course, it should be hyperplane. It's a plane of dimension 3 in Minkowski space, which is dimension 4. Of course, in the drawing, I suppress one dimension. I suppress the z dimension here. I have only t, x, and y. And I take the plane defined by this simple equation. T minus x is 0. So t minus x is 0, again, in dimension 4 space. This defines a free surface, okay, a free plane. So I call this function u. The metric here is the thing that was written by Thomas, of course, the Minkowski metric. So I get that the gradient, first when I take the nabla is simply the partial derivative for a scalar field. So partial derivative with respect to t, it's +1. Partial derivative with respect to x is -1. With respect to y is 0, and with respect to z it is 0, okay? Then I have to raise the index with a metric, and the metric in that case, it's written like this, but in these components, it's of course the Minkowski metric expressed in Minkowskian coordinates, so it's pretty elementary. It is the diagonal -1, 1, 1, and every else 0. So when I raise with a metric, here, because of the -1, the first -1, which is here, I change simply the sign of the first component, -1, so this one becomes -1. And then, remember that L, by my choice, was collinear to U, and I choose here simply rho equals 0, simplest choice. So no rho, forget about rho. But the minus signs remains. So this minus signs change the minus here to plus plus. And then I get that my normal is this vector. And if I draw it, it matches things graphically. This vector, which is 1 unit along t and 1 unit along x, this vector is tangent to the hypersurface, which is not a surprise because the normal is tangent. We are dealing with a null hypersurface. And it is constant. Yes? Of a scalar field. And here it's a very simple scalar field, t minus x. Whatever I want. Yes, it could be much more complicated. Here, I take the simplest one. I mean, you cannot be simpler than that one, okay? For no. No, it has to be the locus. Generically, when you take a function, which is a smooth function in space-time, and if you look to the locus of its 0, it will be a hypersurface. Or it will have no 0 at all. But if it has some 0, generically, it will be hypersurface. It cannot be only 2 points if it is a smooth ordinary function. Or in some very special cases, yes, it could be, for instance, well, you can find, but generically it will be like this. And for this type, it's like this. Okay, so this is the simplest example. Another natural example, still in Minkowski framework, is the null cone. That's the thing before, but the null cone is very easy to define in terms of scalar field. Here, this is the distance to the origin, okay, and this is the definition, okay, of a null cone in terms of a scalar field. So, if you take this, I consider neither future sheet to the null cone. Then I take the gradient. It's very easy. I take the partial derivative. I have these components. And the minus signs come from here, and this comes from the derivation of this guy here. R is a shorthand notation for this guy. So this means that I have 1 minus x, etc. Again, I raise the index, so I change this +1 to -1. Again, I'm choosing rho equal to 0, so L is simply minus the gradient of U. So I simply change all these minus signs to plus signs, and I get this expression for the normal. So this is the unit vector, coordinate vector d over dt, okay? So this is 1 unit along t, And finally, when you need along dr, let's say along r, so this gives me this guy here. And again, we recover the fact that this vector L is tangent to the hypersurface, as it has to be for a null hypersurface. But a difference with the previous example is that it is no longer constant. Its length is increasing because you have these increasing factors. Well, maybe not so obvious, but it is increasing. Okay, so it is this simplest thing. And finally, having in mind black holes, I'm showing an example of event horizon actually, and we will see this in more detail when we will study the Schwarzschild solution. I'm presenting here the horizon of Schwarzschild. The point is that if you think about the Schwarzschild solution, I'm anticipating on the next lecture, but probably you are already very familiar with the form of the Schwarzschild metric. I guess at least most of you. It is this one's. Okay. I'm writing like this. This is the familiar form of the Schwarzschild metric. And I guess it's okay for everybody. And of course, I'm using G equal 1 and C equal 1. And what I've written here is something different. First, this form is diagonal. I have only squares. Here I have a cross term, dTdr. I have a thing which is quite different from this factor here. Only the first factor is the same. You may say, oh, this one was correct, this one was correct, but all this stuff is not correct. I did a mistake. No, I didn't do a mistake. Simply, it's not the standard coordinates in which we present Schwarzschild. This is why I put a capital T here. It's not the same T, actually. It's a different T. And these coordinates I called Eddington-Finkelstein coordinate. I will explain in details in the next lecture what Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates are. But for the purpose of today, we don't have to care about this. After all, I give you a space-time, which is characterized by this metric. I have a coordinate system T r theta phi. It's called Eddington-Finkelstein or whatever. Don't care about this. I define that the metric is like this. So take this metric as granted, as given to you, okay? And let's think in terms of this metric, and let's look at hypersurfaces, okay? We have the right to do this. So given this metric, now I take a scalar field, which is slightly more complicated than before, I admit. It is 1 minus r over 2m, and I take an exponential here. Actually, I'm looking for the 0 of this function, so it's quite obvious that this will be 0 when r is equal to 2m, because the exponential is never 0. Okay, so you may say, well, why did you put the exponential? If you want to look to the 0 of this field, this one will do the job. I'm doing this because I want all the u equal constant, all the iso surface, not only 0, but u equal 1, u equal minus 2, etc., to be all null hypersurface. I want to have a kind of slicing of space-time by a family of hypersurface. I will focus only on u equals 0. This will be the event horizon. But thanks to this term, this allows for more general things. But okay, if you want this, we will see later. But okay, let's choose this. Then we can compute things. And then, well, we can compute, go all the things. And now the rho is no longer 0. You remember we chose this proportionality factor exponential rho between the gradient of u and L to be 0. Now we demand that we use it to normalize in terms of the coordinates. I want the t coordinate, the t component of L to be 1. So this is one example of a choose of rho. I choose rho such that. So by construction, I have 1 here. And then you can show that it is exactly this. And if you want to, maybe I have in the next slide. Okay, no, I'm going to do this. Okay, I will show you how to do this later. Then we see that on this thing is then defined in all the space. But if I look at the location where u is equal to 0, this is at r equal to m. When r is equal to 2m, this vanishes. And I have that L is exactly d by dt. So it's the unit vector, unit coordinate vector in t. So if I draw a space-time diagram like this, my hypersurface is a constant value of r. So it's a tube in that space-time diagram because it will be r equal to m. So in xy it's a circle. I suppress z. So actually it should not be a circle, the space section. It should be a sphere. Okay, it's r equal to m. It's a sphere. And then the sphere is pushed forward in time, if you want, along these lines. And this L is simply d by dt, so it's the unit vector in t, so it's constant. And again, it's tangent, of course, to the null hypersurface. Okay, so this is the Schwarzschild horizon, and we are going to study it a little bit more. Okay. Again, this is to explain why I choose this complicated function of u. This is u equals 0. This is r and t here. This is my null hypersurfaces. And then u equal -1, -2, 1, and 2. All are null hypersurfaces, actually, thanks to this choice. So this is thanks to this term here. All the computations are in the notes and also in some SageMath notebook. We will see later. Okay, this is the null normal. I will skip this. Not so important for a moment. Okay. Now I'm going to establish an identity which is very important for the study of null hypersurfaces. It's the so-called Frobenius identity. It's very easy to establish. It's an elementary tensor calculus. And we do like this. We start, remember the definition that L was proportional to the gradient of it. So I take with the, by lowering the indices here. So the one form point of view. If I take the covariant derivative nabla, which is a space-time covariant derivative, I guess probably Thomas will introduce this with great details in his lecture. Here, I assume that you know more or less already what is a covariant derivative. Then I have two terms. So again, covariant derivative, it's like an ordinary derivative. It has to obey Leibniz rule. When I have a product, I first take the derivative of first term and then the derivative of second term. So I have this. And then if I permute the indices alpha and beta and take minus sign, so I subtract the thing, so I have a kind of anti-symmetrization here. Then, because you probably know that for a scalar field, this is a property of a covariant derivative. We have that for scalar field, you can commute, because U is a scalar field, you can commute the two indices here, okay? This is called, this is a no torsion property. It says that the connection here, the so-called Levi-Civita connection, has no torsion by definition. So because it is symmetric, this guy, when I anti-symmetrize, this term will disappear, okay? So I get only the first term with a change of signs because of this minus here. So I have simply this term here. And if I think that L is related to rho like this, so here appears L, okay, this is L beta, so I have grad alpha rho, and this term here is simply L beta, and this term here is simply L alpha. So I get this. So this is a remarkable identity, which has quite a deep meaning in terms of exterior calculus, or so-called Cartan calculus. This is a two form. This is basically a bilinear form, but which is antisymmetric by construction. And this is the so-called exterior derivative of a one form L, okay? And this is the gradient one form, the differential of basically the differential of a scalar field rho. And this is this antisymmetric thing here is called the wedge product or exterior product. It's like this. But we can, if you don't know about Cartan calculus, don't pay too much attention to this. This could be a kind of side remark. We will need only this tensor form here. And this tensor form, we can do very useful thing is to contract it with L itself. So I have a two-index thing here. I may make a contraction with L. I'm free to do this, okay? I do the contraction with L to get something interesting. When I do the contraction with L, I have this guy. So I'm using the mu letters for repeated indices. Okay, so I have this. And here I have simply, yes, I have simply expressed, I think I made a, because there is this row term here, okay? So I should have put the row here, okay? Anyway. Ah yes, no, this is the left-hand side, so sorry. This is the left-hand side contracted with L, which is equal to the right-hand side contracted with L. So it is exactly this guy and this guy. So this is 0 because L is a null vector. And now, if I look at this term here, this term I can write it again, I'm using Leibniz rule, like this, minus like this. So again, this is 0 because L is a null vector. So if I put this on the left-hand side, I have twice itself. Twice itself being 0 means that the quantity itself needs to be 0, okay? So this guy here is 0. So at the end of the day, I have this guy is equal to this guy. So this is what I have written here, provided I define kappa to be this object, the gradient of rho along L, the derivative of rho along L, which I may denote like this. So I have a very simple equation. It is that the derivative of a vector field L along itself, the covariant derivative of L along itself, is parallel to itself. This is a very non-trivial property. In general, if you take in space-time a vector field, V, and you take the derivative of V along itself, it's something, it can be whatever, but it's not, usually, it's not, it's another vector field, but it has no reason a priori to be collinear to itself. When it is so, we say that the vector field is actually pre-geodesic, because you may have recognized the equation giving a geodesic field. We may rescale the vector field to make exactly 0 here, provided we redefine properly alpha, and I left you as an exercise to do it. I'm rescaling, I can rescale L to L prime, so that the derivative of L prime along itself is 0. And here I recognize the geodesic equation written in vector form. If we want to make the link with the geodesic equation written by Thomas in his lecture, it's quite easy. We have simply to express, so I have here this L prime mu and mu of L prime alpha. We have simply to express the covariant derivative here in terms of a partial derivative. This is L prime alpha dx mu plus, and here you have the Christoffel symbols which will appear. Mu. So you have this, and okay, and you have to contract with L prime mu. Okay, and then if you introduce some parametrization along your curve, such that so you have a parametrization by lambda prime, such that L prime is dx by d lambda prime, is the derivative vector associated to this parametrization of your curve. Then here it's pretty easy to see that you will get the second derivative of x divided by lambda prime. This is the first term, and the second term will be gamma alpha mu dx mu dl prime d lambda prime dx mu d lambda prime. And here you recognize the so-called geodesic equation. But you can also define simply in the vector terms a geodesic to be a curve such that a tangent vector L or L prime here is parallel to itself like this. It's what Thomas called the straightest possible lines in space-time. The tangent vector remains parallel to itself all the way. So this is a geodesic. So we reach the important conclusion here that the field lines of L prime are geodesics, but they are the same as the field lines of L, because L and L prime are collinear. So it means that they are null geodesics. So this is an important quantity, which is possible only because we started from a null hypersurface, because we used many times that L was a null vector here. Okay, and this coefficient kappa, in the Njeri case, it's not 0, okay? And we may call it the non-affinity coefficient because in the case it is 0 for L prime. So we may say that the kappa of L prime, if we had chosen L prime, is 0. And then when it is 0, this parameter, which is associated to L prime, lambda prime, is called an affine parameter of a geodesic. It's called affine parameter because any such object, any such parameter, if you make a reparametrization of the geodesic, it has to be, all these parameters are related by affine transformations like this to preserve the 0. If you have a more general reparametrization, because here on our curve we have two parameterizations. We have lambda prime and we have lambda, which is, maybe use a different color. Lambda is another parameterization, okay, of the same curve. I am free to do so. And lambda is associated to L. My vector L is the tangent vector, is the derivative vector associated with the parameterization with lambda. So I have L prime, which is alpha L. This is my relation between the two vectors, and this is some function. If you want, this alpha is some function of lambda. Okay, and because kappa is non-zero for L, I call this the non-affine coefficient, non-affinity affinity coefficient. Okay. So the conclusion, the thing that you have to keep in mind here is that a null hypersurface, not only its normal is null, but also the field lines of the normals, which are tangent to the hypersurface, are null geodesic. Which is not trivial, by the way, because you may know that, you may say, oh, it's pretty trivial because L is a null vector, so its field lines, they are null curves. I mean, they're curves of length 0, so they are geodesic because they are the shortest possible curve because the length is 0. No, this is not true. You may have in space-time curves whose length is 0, but they are not geodesic. Geodesic means being the straightest possible lines. And an example of this is an helix. For instance, in Minkowski space-time, I give you this as an exercise. You may find helices in Minkowski like this. Or I can give a solution. The point on the helix is given by some parameter like this, cos lambda. So T, X, Y, Z has to be lambda, cos lambda, sine lambda. If you study this curve, okay, defined by this parametric equation, so T is lambda, okay, X is cos lambda, Y is sine lambda, and Z is 0. So if I draw it in terms of T, X, and Y, I get an helix. And if you look at the tangent vector to this helix, dx by as a vector by lambda, I call it L, you will find it's a null vector. This is a simple exercise. It's a null vector. Nevertheless, this is not a geodesic of Minkowski because all geodesics, either space-like, time-like, or null in Minkowski, what are they? In Minkowski space, what are the geodesics? Straight lines. Because they are the lines along which the normal L, let's say, is parallel to itself. Okay? Here, it's an helix, so the normal is not parallel to itself. It turns. Okay? But it's a null curve. The length, the metric length, is 0. Okay? So it's a non-trivial property of these null hypersurfaces to have null geodesics along them. The normal is along null geodesics. This is an important property. And it's so important that we give a name to this normal. We call them null generators. And we may see this on the examples. Let's go back to our three examples. First, the null hyperplane. For the null hyperplane, we had that L is a constant vector. Remember, in that case, L was dt plus dx, simply. So when I take the covariant derivative, it's very easy with respect to Minkowski connection. So it was, yes, this one. it's constant coefficient. So all in Minkowski coordinate, it's simply partial derivative, this covariant derivative. So because it's a constant vector, it's clearly 0. So the derivative on itself is 0. So this means that kappa is 0 in that case, because let me remind you this important equation that we have. Derivative of L along itself is kappa L. Or if you want in terms of indices, this is L mu nabla mu L alpha is kappa L alpha. So this is the same equation. So because we have 0, we have kappa equals 0. For the null con, again, you can compute it, and you will find 0 again. Whereas, as I said before, L is not constant, but along itself, actually, it gives the derivative along itself is 0. But it's not a constant vector, of course, in space-time. But kappa is 0. And for the Schwarzschild horizon, which was defined as r equal to m in that case, we may compute things, and things that kappa is not 0 in that case, actually. It's 1 over 4m, where m is the parameter entering the metric. And since this is, in that case, it's a pretty tedious computation because you have to compute the covariant derivative of a vector field with a Christoffel symbol and things like this. Of course, you can do this as an exercise, but you can also do this by using computer algebra code. And I'm showing you an example here to do it with SageMath. I'm choosing SageMath because it's a free computer algebra system, so you can download it, install it on your computer. You can use it also thanks to something which is called Cocalc on the cloud. And let me show you the computation of kappa, for instance, with SageMath. So I give you here an example of notebook doing this computation. The beginning of a notebook is not so important, but we define here a manifold of dimension 4. We give it a name M, and we say that it has a Lorentzian structure. Well, then we define a chart, a coordinate chart, I mean coordinates on this manifold, T, R, theta, phi by these symbols. We specify the range in that string here, the range of the coordinates, theta and 0 pi, and also we may simplify specify the LaTeX symbol to use to display things, and phi is between 0 and 2 pi. Then we have our coordinates. Then we introduce the parameter to define the metric, the mass parameter m, that is positive or 0. And then we define here the metric. So by the way, SageMath, if you don't know it, it's based on Python. So if you're familiar with Python, this is exactly Python language. It does not has its own language. It's using Python. You have this object-oriented language like this. You take the manifold and the metric associated to the manifold. Then you define G naught naught to be this guy. So this is exactly, I am entering what I've shown you before for this metric in Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates. So 0, 1 is for the TR component. It is 2m over r. So I will have this cross term here. And 1 plus 2m over r. I have r square and r sine theta square. And then I have this function once I have a metric. Display will show me the metric like this. I can have a matrix view if I want to see only the components of a metric. This is like a list notation in Python when you want to see all the list. You can do something like this. And I have this metric with these two off-diagonal terms here. I can ask Sage to compute the inverse of a metric. And again, so it will take the inverse of that matrix simply, and it gives this object here. I can ask for the Christoffel symbols, so we'll compute the Christoffel symbols, bloop, like this. It displays only the non-zero one. There are many ones, but the non-zero are not displayed by default. We may check it's a solution of the Einstein equation. It's very easy. I take the Ricci tensor. So when the Ricci is 0, it means I have a solution in vacuum because the Einstein equation, you know, it is like this. And when I take it in vacuum, it means the energy momentum tensor is 0. And then it is equivalent because R is the trace of this guy here. This is equivalent to the Ricci itself is 0. Okay. So here is computing the Ricci tensor, and I display, and then I get 0. So this is a valid solution of Einstein equation. And then I introduce the scalar field U. by this formula here that I've shown before. This quite complicated formula with the exponential. So I do like this. I define a scalar field on the manifold. I give a coordinate expression in the chart that I've called capital X. It's the only chart that I have on my manifold. It was defined just previously. It was, yes, here. It was this capital X, and here I specify the symbols that I want to use for the coordinates. Okay, this capital X for the system, it's the coordinate chart. So I gave here, okay, this scalar field by this expression. So if I ask for a display of my scalar field, is answering this. I can make a plot of the isosurface. Okay, this I skip. This is what I've shown before. Now I take the differential of my scalar field. It's a one form. It is exactly this one form. It's computing now, the differential. Then I take the gradient. I raise the index with a metric g. This is this up function to raise the indices. And I get this vector field. Okay, when you display, you get this vector field. I can check it is a zero vector field. So that I'm dealing really with a null hypersurface because the gradient is a normal. So I compute G. It's not trivial because you know that G is not a metric, a diagonal metric. It has some this cross term TR. So, but the system is computing for you. And if you demand what is the expression of this scalar field, it is 0. Then I construct the null normal by choosing rho. I choosing rho to be actually the gradient of the t component, the log of the t component of the gradient, so that to normalize to 1, but whatever. And here I'm demanding that L is minus exponential rho times the gradient of u. And I have my L that I've shown you before. Okay, I can ask for a plot of this vector field by the command plot. I have a graph with some plot option, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is this vector field L in all space. And notice that R equal to M. This is a space-time diagram, of course. This is T here, T versus R. It is this constant d by dt vector. Here it's going, this is again a null vector, but here it's going like this, and here it's going like this. Okay, and I want to compute kappa. So again, I can check it's a null vector. Then if I want to compute kappa, I introduce first nabla. Nabla, it's the Levi-Civita connection associated to G. So again, I get it like this. And then I have this nabla. I can compute nabla of L. And I can make a contraction of nabla of L with L to get this. This was this identity here, but sorry. The nabla of L along itself should be. Okay, I skip this. Skip this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the important line is here. I make the so-called acceleration. So acceleration is simply this guy here. Make all this an acceleration because if it was a 4 velocity, this would be nothing but the 4 acceleration if L was u. It's not a 4 velocity because it's a null vector. And then if we contract it with itself, we get this vector, and we can get the coefficient of proportionality kappa. We can check, yes, we can check this equation that if kappa is given by this, we have the acceleration is kappa L. And we can get the expression of kappa, and the value when R is equal to 2m is simply 1 over 4m. Okay, so this is an example how to compute things with Sage. So again, if you go on the lecture on pages, you can download, this one. If you go to SageMath worksheets, you can download. If you click on this, you go to exactly to that page. You can download the corresponding notebook by clicking on this button here for instance and running on Sage. Okay, so let's come back to the main thing. Okay. Yes. It's different thing. Exact is based on Mathematica. So to run Exact, you need to have Mathematica installed on your computer. As you know, Mathematica is not a free software. It's not free at all, by many aspects of the word, free. So whereas Sage is free in all aspects of the world. You can download it for free, and also it's open source. It's Python sources and things like this. So I prefer very much Sage with respect to Mathematica, but this is a matter of taste. And okay, let's come back to just in the remaining few minutes. let's move further into the geometry of null hypersurfaces, because now we are going to see something which is very relevant for the event horizon of a black hole. It's the concept of cross-section and area of a black hole. So a cross-section, it can be defined for any null hypersurface, not necessarily a black hole horizon, to be simply a two-dimensional surface which is inside the hypersurface, so tangent to it if you want, and which crosses everywhere, this is why it's called a cross-section, the null normal. The null normal is nowhere tangent to a cross-section, and each null generator, let me remind you that the null generator, this is this null geodesics, this is the field lines of L, so this is this green curves here, this is the null generator, this null geodesics, and then we have something which everywhere intersects this null geodesics, once and only once, as in this drawing. And it's very easy to see that the first property of this cross-section is to be space-like surface. Now, it's easy to imagine this surface because now it's really two-dimensional surfaces, because the horizon here, or the null hypersurface, is three-dimensional one. It's difficult to picture it, but this S is two-dimensional object. Of course, since I suppress for the drawing one dimension, they look like one-dimensional, like circles, but in reality, you have to think in terms of sphere or thing like this. Okay, and what I'm claiming here is that it's space-like. Being space-like means every vector tangent to S has to be a space-like vector. And the proof is very easy, because on a null hypersurfaces, you can have only two kinds of vectors, either space-like vectors of null vector, and if it is a null vector, it has to be collinear to the null normal. You cannot have any time-like vector tangent to null hypersurfaces. You can think about it, you can try on various examples on Minkowski space. It's not possible to make a time-like, a time-like vector tangent to null hypersurfaces. So that because so a vector tangent to S has to be either space-like or null. It cannot be null, because if it were null, it has to be collinear to L, and then this will be violate the first hypothesis here. So it has to be space-like, so I'm dealing with space-like. All the cross-section are space-like. Okay. Now, since space-like, we may define something interesting. An interesting geometrical concept is the expansion of along the null normal. We do like this. We take a cross-section S and the null normal, so everything here is along the null hypersurface H, and then we displace the points of the surface S by some elementary quantity epsilon along L. So I take P, a point P, I displace it by a quantity epsilon along L, I get a new point P epsilon, say. If I repeat this operation for all the points of my surface, again, it's drawn as a circle here, but you have to imagine it's a two surface, okay? If I do everything keeping the same epsilon at every point, this is important, in keeping the same value of epsilon, then I obtain new points, see, everywhere. So these new points, if I join them, they define a new surface, a new cross-section on my horizon that I may call S epsilon, okay? And then I may look at this area, because now I have space-like surface. I may define the area. The area is defined as being by the metric induced on the surface, induced by the space-like metric, the ambient metric. Because I am on a space-like hypersurface, the induced metric is signature plus plus. It's positive definite metric, so it's kind of ordinary scalar product. So this defines a kind of ordinary area, if you want. It's nothing fancy here. I'm not with Lorentzian signature. I'm with Riemannian signature, the plus plus, positive definite things. So I may consider the area here of a small element. Again, it looks like a length, but you have to think about it as an area. It's a two-dimensional. And when I transform P to P epsilon and Q to Q epsilon, this defines a new area element here. And I may compare these two area elements and define the expansion of a surface along L as the variation, the relative variation of this area element. Of course, this relative variation will be proportional to epsilon, so I divide by epsilon here, and I take the limit when epsilon goes to 0, which has to get something like a derivative, if you want, okay? And by definition, I get a number at each point on my surface, and I call this number theta of L. This is the expansion along my null surface L. And okay, so this is the way we define this expansion. And I will just conclude for today by saying that this expansion, well, you can convince yourself that it depends solely on the null normal. It does not depend on the cross-section. At a given point, I could have defined it for a cross-section S, another cross-section going through the same point S prime. Both cross-sections will have the same expansion. This is why I don't specify S in this by only theta and L. And moreover, if I reparameterize L by some quantity alpha, I will get a multiplication of expansion by the same quantity alpha. Okay, so it depends only on L. And I think, yes, we will see examples because I will stop at this point. It's time to have lunch. And tomorrow, so we will continue this before moving to the Schwarzschild black hole. We will continue, yes, to discuss this geometry of null hypersurfaces because it's really important to have a good understanding of black hole horizons. So thank you for today and see you tomorrow.